Hey guys, welcome back. David from Wax Wings Photography here. Today we're going to edit the photos that we took in the last video of the Milky Way. If you haven't already seen it, I'll put the link up here. Pause this video, go watch it so that you know what we did. And the whole point was to show that you can take a photo of the Milky Way even with a cheap camera as long as you have a tripod and a little know-how. And we'll get editing. Okay, so here we are in Lightroom. We're going to start by having a look at the shot that I took of the Milky Way using the original first generation EOS M. It's got an APS-C sensor. It's kind of old, but as you can see, even in this unedited RAW version, there's you can see the faint outline of the Milky Way galactic core. So with the fact that we shot in RAW, we should have enough data here to get out something usable. So what we can see here first of all is that the sky is still kind of light, has some color, is a bit blue. So that means that probably we didn't wait late enough for all the sky to be completely dark, but that's okay. We'll start by actually going down here. The first thing I like to do is to enable a profile correction, because that sort of adjusts for the vagaries of the lenses themselves. We don't need to remove chromatic aberration, I think, at this stage. And if we just zoom in and wait for the preview to load properly, there we are. And we can see it's still pretty noisy, but the stars are relatively sharp. There's a little bit of smearing because we let it was a bit of long exposure, and the stars they move across the sky over that time, but I think we'll be okay. So onto the basic tab first of all. Let's see if we can increase the contrast just a little bit. Okay, and I think we'll try to bring down the blacks next. There we go. The galactic core is starting to show up. There's a bit more contrast in the image there. I think if we raise the whites a little bit, we'll get a bit more of the stars shining a bit brighter. And now we need to mess around in the midtones to see what else we can bring out. So sometimes every image is a bit different, so you have to play around a little bit. But counterintuitively, if you bring up the shadows, sometimes you get a little more contrast in the way that you want. And then playing with the highlights is also a bit of a die roll, but I think in this case we'll bring them down. So the next thing to do is to play with dehaze. Dehaze is actually really cool for a variety of reasons. If we bring it up, sometimes we get a little more local contrast there. Okay, so that is pretty good. Now, as I said, the sky is pretty blue, and that is somewhat natural, but I think that we can possibly do better. So why don't we just slowly bring up the color temperature a little bit. Right, so that's good. The sky is less blue now, and we have more distinct color in the galactic core again. Zooming in, obviously we've still got some noise. We'll get to the noise in a second, but I just want to see if we can get a little more up with the clarity. Clarity you have to be a little careful of, because it can really hit on the noise pretty hard, and accentuate it if you're not careful. So like if we do that, it all gets pretty gross, right? So we want to bring that back down. There we go. Okay, now color is pretty important, so bring up the vibrance a little, and also the saturation, but you don't want to overwhelm it with the blue, because the blue's sort of coming back now. Now, one final check with the exposure slider. I think that's the best we can get. So it's not terrible. I'm not going to play with the tone curve, but we can see about clearing up the noise a little bit. What we'll do is we will grab that noise reduction tool and bring it up a little bit. There's a cute shortcut where if you hold down Alt Option, it removes the color, so you get a better sense of the luminance, and that's and how the noise is being reduced there. So the thing is, you don't want to like ram the noise reduction all the way up, because obviously it's going to remove a lot of the detail. Like, interestingly, we can actually see the colors a bit more strongly there, but I don't think that looks pretty good. It's way too smooth, and you lose all the detail in the Milky Way. So let's bring it down back to 22, which looks okay. Try to bring up the contrast in that noise reduction and the detail as well. So that is pretty good. Let's see if we can just get a little bit more by messing with the global contrast. I think we're good. Now, let's put a bit of a crop. Let's imagine we're going to put this on Instagram. So you want to probably try the square crop first of all. That's okay. I think that still shows a bit too much of the tree there. Why don't we try the 5x4? So at least with these raw files, we have a good amount of resolution that if we do a vertical crop out like that, it will generally look okay still. So I like to say not terrible. We've got a little bit of foreground to keep people grounded, but obviously the main feature is the Milky Way here. Alright, I'm pretty happy with that. Let's go back and have a look at the image originally. And with just a few tweaks, you can see that we've brought out the Milky Way and sharpened the stars up a little bit. And that's ready for sharing and raking in those likes. So let's move on to our second image now. It's actually the same composition as before, but it's with the Sony RX100 Mark I. So it's the zoom is as wide as we can, and the aperture again as wide as we could have it, and that was at f1.8. But because the sensor is smaller, it's a smaller camera, we've got a little more cropping going on. So this time we don't actually have a camera profile to use for correction, so there's no point doing that. So let's jump straight into the basics tab. Now you'll notice that this image is a lot more overexposed than the first one. I think we must have left it running a bit longer, but that's okay. If we zoom in, we can see again there's a bit of that star trail effect going on because it was a long exposure, but I'm not too worried about that. The first thing that we want to do is try to get that exposure down. So why don't we pull it down by a whole stop to begin with, and then bump the contrast a lot. Right. So you can see the Milky Way and the galactic core starting to come out, and we'll bring those blacks all the way down. Looks good. And the shadows about there. The whites, I think it's a hard call. So we bring them a bit down this so that we get back the blackness in this bottom left area near the tree. And then highlights, I think we'll also bring down. Now the all important dehaze, I think is going to go a bit too much this time, so we'll do that just to 11, and then clarity comes up. Okay, so that's the basic exposure and contrast out of the way. What we want to do now is have a look at the color. Now, here's a trick that I learned. If sometimes you can get good effects to figure out what exactly you want in the color by bumping up the vibrance and saturation all the way, and then that gives you a sense of what the colors actually are. So I'm seeing a lot of magenta in there, so if we just bring the magenta out of it slightly by bringing it down. Okay, now if we then take the temperature and mess with that a little bit, I think because of all the blue we are going to have to make it warmer again. Not that warm, that's too warm, we've lost all the blue. There we go, there seems to be a bit of a balance. Alright, let's we bring down the vibrance and saturation again. And then we slowly bring those two up. Okay, it's very visible now. The stars are really hot purple though. I think we've got to bring it down so that it's not quite so apparent. There we go. Let's have another little tweak. Bring the temperature. Okay. Alright, I think that looks pretty good. Now, think that we want to see if we can, now that we've brought up the saturation, that blue is really started to come out again. So let's do something a little more advanced than in the last one. We'll use a graduated mask here to at least try to drop down the exposure in this bottom bit a little bit. So if we just start there. Now, if we just change the effect to burn to darken it, and then stretch that out a little bit. Now, see what it's like with it off. See, the only thing is really that that's still a lot less saturated. Let's bring the vibrance down a little bit. Let's pull those blacks. Whoa, not that far. So finally, let's pick a crop that we like. I think if we go once again for try the 1:1, see what we feel. I mean, obviously we got rid of the yellow tree in the foreground there, but that's kind of boring. I think I like having the tree there. So let's reset that. Let's make it a 4x5. And if we include the tree, we don't have to include all the empty space on the right side. How about that? Okay. Drop the exposure maybe a little bit more. Okay, now let's fix it up with a little noise reduction. Just bring that up there. Make sure we'll get a little more contrast. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that looks a little too muddy, so let's bring that noise reduction a little back. a bit further back. Also the color noise reduction. Alright, looks good. Let's have a look at how it was before. Gross and washed out. And then we've brought the Milky Way back to be a bit more visible there. And finally, so this is the one that one of the ones that I took with the A7 II on the Samyang 14mm, and it's from the first part of the night where I was up on top of Mount Edelong with the wider panorama. Now I've got a full frame camera here with a very wide lens, so we're catching a large part of both the sky and the sea. I think let's start with lens corrections. Now, we don't actually have the profiles here, and that's because the lens I have is completely manual, so we need to tell it what we're using ourselves. So if we scroll down, choose Samyang, and then change it to 14mm f2.8, and then the Sony FE. That looks better, right? And I think the next thing that we should do is probably straighten that horizon. So open up the crop panel, and if you grab this little tool here next to the angle, you can actually draw out the horizon that you want to keep like this, and it'll sort things out. Alright, I think that looks pretty good. I think we're going to stick with this crop because it's worth keeping in as much as possible. The cloud, when I was shooting, it was pretty annoying that the cloud rolled in, but I kind of like the way that it sort of is parallel to the Milky Way here. So we're going to keep most of it in. Let's jump into the basic panel to get going with the exposure. Now it does look pretty overexposed again, so let's start by bringing that back down, 0.5 maybe a bit more, maybe -1. Looks too dark, but we can come back to that. Bring up the contrast a little. Now the cloud is going to make things a little interesting here. Obviously it's big and kind of white and bright by comparison, but let's ignore that for now and focus in on the Milky Way. Now interestingly, bringing in the shadows isn't doing anything to the Milky Way, it's mostly doing stuff to the foreground. So I wonder if... Okay, so the highlights are also, let me reset that. Highlights are also not playing ball. Let's start by bringing those blacks down. There we go. Okay, so what I've done there is I actually played with the contrast and exposure a little bit to try to make the Milky Way a little more visible. So if we bring up the whites, we actually get a bit more of the Milky Way. It's just that the cloud gets in the way a little bit there. We bring the blacks down a bit more now. We get what we want. Yes. Okay. So you can see that 3 different photos require different techniques to get what we want there. Normally what you're trying to do is bump the contrast, but in some cases that doesn't work. Now what that has done though is really brighten up this cloud, and it's pretty distracting. So I'm going to change our crop, I think a 1:1, so we keep some of the cloud there, but it's obviously not the focus, so to speak, of the photo. Now let's see if we can do some work specifically on the Milky Way using a radial filter. So we'll drag that up and rotate it, and then extend it a little bit like that. Now we make it really big because if we want this to not affect too many things, I'm going to just reset this effect completely for a moment and show you the mask overlay. So you can see this actually covers a lot of the image very strongly. What I want to do is just bring the feather up to fade it out a little more. Now we'll turn off the overlay, maybe recenter it a little bit and get to work. So what I want to do here is some stuff specifically to the Milky Way. We can actually bring down the exposure a little bit, bring up the contrast, increase the dehaze, but not too much. Then we can play with the clarity a little bit. That render out. See what we can do with the sharpness slider. Yeah, you got to be careful with the sharpness slider. Like, your instinct is obviously going to be to try to sharpen the stars, but to be honest, that tends to make more mess than you can clean up. So now, if we're focusing here, we can bring up the shadows, so we're starting to see this structure here in the middle of the Milky Way. Again with the highlights. Now bring up the yellow in the temperature as well, and make the tint a little. Let's have a look, see what happens when we go green. Kind of looks pretty mucky. If we bring a little more magenta, it looks cooler that way. A bit more yellow again. Okay. If we bring down the blacks just a tad, we get a bit more of that structure. Very nice. Alright, so let's close that. See if we can sort out the noise a little bit. Again, we don't want to make things too muddy because obviously losing the detail in the Milky Way defeats the purpose of the exercise here. Alright, I think that's probably enough. We'll just bump up the contrast a little bit, and I'm pretty happy with that. So I think one more thing that we want to do is to see if we can bring up some detail in the bottom here. So we're going to just put in a little gradient filter here. Just drag it up near the horizon. Use shift to make sure it stays straight. And then let's bring up the exposure just a tad. And the shadows. And the blacks. There we go. I think we might try to see the highlights. No, we need to bring those shadows back down. So I'm not liking the yellowness in the clouds here, so what we're going to do is try to use another mask to try to cool them off a little bit. So we're going to start with gradient mask and just reset everything and just grab the temperature and bring it down to take the yellow out. Unfortunately, what that's done is made the blue in the sky come out a little too much, so we're going to use a range mask and just bring up the luminance until it's only affecting the clouds and not affecting the sky. Let's see how that works. Okay, that doesn't look too bad, but what I want to do is also bring down the exposure so that it doesn't overwhelm the picture. Okay, that looks pretty cool. So there we have it. Let's take one last look. We'll click done here to get rid of those mask markers, how this image looked before, how it looks after. We can definitely see the Milky Way much more clearly. Okay guys, I hope you found that helpful. Between these two videos, I think that should be a really great kickstart for anybody who's thinking about getting into astrophotography. The main thing is that you really just need a little bit of know-how. You don't need expensive gear, especially because it's not something that you can really get out and do very often. So I recommend just giving it a try with whatever gear you already have. Use Lightroom, because honestly the raw photos aren't going to be much to look at. They're certainly not going to be like all those Instagram photos that you're probably loving. Anyway, speaking of Instagram, make sure you check me out at WaxWingsPhoto. I'm also on Facebook. I'll put all the links in the description. Let me know what you thought of this video. Do you like Lightroom tutorials? Do you want slightly more advanced ones? I'll see you in the next one. Thanks a lot.